The Arkansas Archeological Survey is part of the University of Arkansas system. Our mission is to study and protect archaeological sites in Arkansas, to preserve and manage information and collections from these sites, and to communicate what we learn to the people of Arkansas. Cooperative agreements with seven state university campuses, 2 state parks, and the UA Systems Winthrop Rockefeller Institute and the city of Blytheville enable scholars at 11 research stations around the state to carry out this mission. And I'll just point out that I'm stationed, obviously, in Fayetteville at the survey's coordinating office. Since it was created in 1967 by the Arkansas General Assembly, the Arkansas Archeological Survey has conducted approximately 1,200 archaeological excavation projects. Many of these have been at sites now destroyed by farming activities and the construction of highways, reservoirs, airports, and housing subdivisions. Other excavations have been at sites owned by the state of Arkansas, such as Parkin Archaeological State Park, Toltec Mounds Archaeological State Park, Historic Washington State Park, or on other protected lands in the state. In addition, there have been about 3,000 other archaeological projects funded by the Arkansas Highway and Transportation Department, the U.S. Forest Service, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. One of the most important tasks for archaeologists is to record archaeological sites. The survey office in Fayetteville is the repository for all Arkansas site records and photographs associated with archaeological excavations. There are now over 47,000 archaeological sites on record in Arkansas. A particularly important subset of archaeological sites are historic cemeteries. With the advent of Ancestry.com and other online genealogical resources, there's been a huge upswing in public interest in cemeteries, and this is certainly true for Arkansas. Many cemeteries are at risk for damage or destruction by construction, vandalism, farming, and erosion. About 10 years ago, the Arkansas state archeologist, Dr. Ann Early, started a project to encourage members of historical societies and genealogists to provide her with information on pioneer-era cemeteries in Arkansas. This project has been very successful, but there are many more cemeteries to be recorded. So today I'm going to talk about several archaeological projects we've done in recent times involving historic cemeteries. 2 of these are examples of contract research done for federally funded construction projects, one involving a highway project and another water supply expansion, and 2 other projects illustrates how the survey assists sister state agencies. The expansion of Lake Fort Smith by the city of Fort Smith in 2002 inundated the Becky, Wright, and Eddy cemeteries in Crawford County. Before the expansion, the survey conducted excavations to recover human remains, casket hardware, and personal items. So in the planning for the new reservoir, these 2 sites were to be destroyed. While the cemeteries were less than 1 mile apart and appeared virtually identical from the surface, analysis of the graves showed that there were dramatic differences between the 2 cemeteries. The location of burials, size and style of gravestone, coffin hardware, clothing, and other personal items is a reflection of an individual's place in the community, including socioeconomic status. Since the cemeteries were to be inundated, we had a unique opportunity to collect this kind of information. Okay, the Eddy Cemetery was associated with the Samuel Eddy family. There were 16 interments with 11 containing skeletal remains. The Becky Wright Cemetery was northeast of Eddy on a tract of land deeded to the Methodist Episcopal Church South in 1854 for use as a campground. The cemetery name came from the nearby Becky Wright School, which burned in 1911. So this cemetery had 10 interments with 7 individuals represented by skeletal remains. Why did the small community living along Frog Bayou need 2 small cemeteries located so closely to each other? Before excavations began, only one difference between the 2 cemeteries was known. that the Eddy Cemetery began as a burial place for a single family. Individuals buried in the Becky Wright Cemetery did not appear to be related, so it's possible that burial here may have been based on religious affiliation. More likely is that the Becky Wright Cemetery was used for those without strong family ties in the area. Careful study of remains and associated artifacts revealed many differences between the two cemeteries. At Becky Wright, a more labor-intensive type of grave shaft was dug. There was greater use of vaulting at Becky Wright. Vaulting refers to the custom of excavating a wide primary grave shaft to a depth of 3 or 4 feet, and then a narrower secondary shaft was dug. And then once the casket was lowered into the grave, pieces of wood were laid across here. This is seen as a reflection of traditional folkways that fell out of favor by the 1890s. And the reason for doing this seems to be to protect the feelings of the bereaved, so they didn't see the dirt actually being shoveled into the grave and falling on the top of the casket. Although very little wood was preserved, there was coffin hardware present. The two cemeteries had virtually no hardware in common. At both cemeteries, there was minimal hardware in conservative styles. It is not possible to compare coffins and caskets from the two cemeteries, since almost no wood survived. And I will mention in passing that the lack of preservation of organic material in Ozark soils is very common. Ozark soils are very acidic, and so even metal objects like the hardware I showed you are badly corroded. And iron objects, for example, nails, do not survive very well, and then human bone does not either. So that just makes things a little bit more challenging for us. So a type of interior coffin fastener shown here. This is the actual hardware, and this is what they looked like without the corrosion on them. Okay. So this fastener was present only at the Eddy Cemetery, suggesting that there might have been two different sources for coffins for the two cemeteries. Clothing remains recovered include buttons, buckles, suspender hardware, cuff and collar studs, and shoes. Based on the absence of men's collar studs at Becky Wright, there was a lack of formal dress shirts on men buried there, possibly a reflection of a folk prohibition against placing shoes on a body for burial. Only 1 of 10 individuals at Becky Wright was wearing shoes. This was a man who suffered a quick and violent death due to gunshot. At Eddy Cemetery, 7 of 16 interments had shoes, and the same number had some type of jewelry. No jewelry was present in the Becky Wright graves. There were 3 individuals buried at Becky Wright with unique artifacts that suggest vernacular folk beliefs. A spur that is showing now that also was associated with the gunshot victim. And this is the lead ball that killed him. And this tablespoon that was found with an infant, and then a leather shoe that was lying on top of the coffin lid of a woman's grave. The spoon might represent the last object touched by the individual in life. The same may be true for the spur. The gunshot victim was wearing it when he died. The single leather shoe atop the woman's coffin may have been viewed as a means to trap the devil before he could steal the recently departed soul. Single shoes have been found atop other caskets in other cemeteries of this time period in other parts of the United States. Although the bone preservation was very poor, there was evidence in teeth from individuals buried at Becky Wright of a condition called linear enamel hyperplasia. It's a deficiency in the formation of enamel on tooth crowns. This indicates stress, possibly from malnutrition or illness during childhood. This is the time when adult teeth begin to form in a child. There was no evidence of this defect in the Eddy Cemetery interments. Samuel and Carolyn Eddy were prosperous but not wealthy. Both of their graves were marked with commercially made gravestones. They were part of an extended family who moved into the area after the Civil War. With the collapse of land values in the 1880s and 90s, however, they moved away. While the individuals buried in the Becky Wright Cemetery were poor and not connected to well-established families, they were landowners and community leaders. In May of 2003, all of the human remains and associated artifacts were reinterred in wooden boxes by the city of Fort Smith in a new cemetery on public land north of the new city of Fort Smith reservoir. The original grave markers and field stones were used. A local minister conducted a service, and several descendants attended. Another project was at a 19th century farmstead in Chester, Arkansas, that was excavated by the survey in 1993. And this is just a view to the west from this farmstead. Unfortunately, this site was subsequently destroyed by the construction of Interstate 540, now Interstate 49. And this is just a little schematic to give you an idea of where the site, where it is in relation to the off-ramp and frontage road. So this site consisted of the remains of a residence, a stone-lined well, rock walls, and a small family cemetery. Traditional excavation techniques were used to gather information about the house and to collect artifacts left by the Dement family. Dr. John L. Dement moved to Chester, Arkansas after serving in the Civil War. He and his second wife, Drusilla, were married in 1881. While the family lived in Chester, 3 infant children, Henry, Francis, and Dorothea, died and were buried near the family home. An important part of this project was to relocate the graves of the Dement children. This proved to be easy in one sense, but very difficult in reality. In 1993, the small grouping of graves was somewhat covered in flowering quince and persimmon, locust and cedar trees, along with some daffodils. So it's a pretty small area actually right in here, and you can see a couple of the headstones. There were 2 commercially made granite markers, one for Francis, that's shown at the left, who died in 1890, aged 2 months, and one for Dorothea at the right, who died in 1896 at 16 months. There was also a footstone for Dorothea on the left. You'll see the initials DD, and then a footstone for Henry W. Dement, there's the initials, who was born and died in 1885. No headstone was found for Henry's grave. We didn't know if these gravestones were in their original position. Let me back up and say about Henry's grave. It's possible that only this small footstone was purchased for his burial, but we just don't know. Going into this, we didn't know if the gravestones were in their original position, if they'd been moved or not. This is our map. Actually, we created this once we had discovered the burials, but I wanted to show you just the kind of vegetation and the type of maps we do as well. So we began our work on the little cemetery by shovel skimming the ground with shovels beneath the pasture. This was a highway department project, obviously, and they provided a backhoe and an operator to assist us. However, this fellow was brand new. He'd never operated a backhoe, and we do use backhoes on archaeological sites, but you've got to be very skilled and able to peel back very thin layers of soil. You can't go in and just gouge and take out massive amounts of soil. So this fellow, he actually did pretty well, considering he was a newcomer. But we directed him to scrape off the soil, as I mentioned, in thin layers as we watched for the outlines of grave shafts. After many hours, we finally saw a subtle soil stain near where the footstone of Dorothea Dement stood. And it is subtle, I grant you. It doesn't show up well, but there's a little area of darkened soil. We could not see the coffin outline. We carefully collected the grave fill, and we knew we had reached the bottom of the coffin when we found in situ nails with the tips pointing up. In other words, these were the nails that had held the bottom of the coffin together. We used these same techniques to excavate the second grave, that of Francis. This time we were able to see the coffin outline because there were several pieces of wood preserved by the hardware. Of course, remember, these are infants, so they would have had small graves. So we were able to see the coffin outline. This is as an overhead view then of where the casket would have been if it was preserved, but you see that we did have the nails and it did form this exact shape. So the only identifiable human remains from the graves was a first deciduous molar belonging to Dorothea Dement, along with about 90 minute bone fragments from her grave. The crown of the molar was in the process of developing. There were many nails found. First, we also found casket hardware, and this slide just shows a variety of, these are called thumb screws, and these are special white metal screws that have special tops. These are the bone fragments. And brass and copper, as you probably know, when they start to degrade, they have a corrosion product that's greenish. I know everyone's seen that. That little bit of metal was in these pieces of wood was enough to preserve the wood, and we did have one tiny little piece of cloth. Dr. Jerry Rose, a bioarchaeologist with the University of Arkansas, tells me that interred skeletal remains rarely survive more than 30 years in acidic, gravelly soils in the Ozarks. And again, these are all iron nails, and basically there's really nothing left of these. This is just the corrosion product, but you can see how terribly worn down, broken down they are. So the story might have ended here with the remains of the artifacts and the gravestones being stored in our curation facility. Before we began excavations, I was interviewed in the Fayetteville newspaper, and a woman from Siloam Springs contacted me. She was one of Dr. John Dement's grandchildren. She told me that after the 3 infants died, the family moved to Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Remember, this was before the internet, so it was really exciting to hear from her. I went to Tahlequah and met the lady who was the cemetery caretaker. She had incredibly detailed records. This is just one page of records that I photocopied. But you can see here, she's got a record for each of these graves. These are other Dement family members. This is Dr. Dement of Chester. And she knew exactly where the Dement family plot was in the cemetery. So, several years after this, David Williamson, a highway department archaeologist, took it upon himself to contact the cemetery caretaker, and he was able to have both the tooth and bone fragments reinterred in the Dement family plot. And here they are working on that. The cemetery also accepted all of the grave markers. Here they are. And a new monument was installed explaining these events. So I don't know if you could read this, but it basically says Henry, Dorothea, and Francis, that these remains had been moved from Chester, Arkansas in 1996. So he went really above and beyond the call of duty, I think, to do this. So now the remains of these 3 infants are next to their parents. The third project I'm going to talk about, in 1996, we were asked by Mammoth Springs State Park in Fulton County, which is on Arkansas-Missouri border, way far northeast Arkansas. They wanted help determining the boundaries of Spring City Cemetery that is inside the park boundaries. Looking east, this is inside Mammoth Springs State Park. This road is the state line. So if you go across the road, you're in Missouri, which is pretty cool, I thought. Euro-American settlement of this area began in the 1820s around the large natural spring at the headwaters of the Spring River. That's the Mammoth Spring, and it's really a cool thing. The cemetery was used throughout the 19th century until the late 1880s. Since the establishment of Mammoth Spring State Park in 1975, the cemetery has been protected and maintained as part of the park. The land was originally part of a city park. State Park staff wanted to know the number and location of individual graves, since over the years markers have deteriorated or have been moved from original positions. There are only a few marked graves in the cemetery. Before our fieldwork began, archival research was done in the hopes of discovering records of the burials, but none were found. Local residents did provide details about public events within the park boundaries over the years that were close to the cemetery. During a walkover survey, other possible graves, unmarked graves, showed up as depressions in the ground. We used a metal detector in select areas to search for remnants of a fence said to have enclosed the cemetery, but we found no evidence of a fence. The state parks provided a front end loader and an operator to assist us. This time we were really lucky because the gentleman that was the backhoe operator was very experienced, something like 35 years of experience, and he had worked at Toltec Mounds excavating with Martha Rawlingson, who was a very exacting archaeologist, so he knew exactly what we wanted. So he started by removing thin layers of the soil so we could locate grave shafts. Now our goal here was not to excavate or move any graves, it was just to see if we could tell where there were graves. So we excavated 14 of these stripped back areas, kind of long, narrow areas, and we were able to see the tops of 13 grave shaft outlines. These contained bright orange and brown mottled silty clay subsoil, so it's mixed, the colors are mixed together, and that happens when the grave shaft is dug. It's thrown up on the sides, and then when it's filled in, the dirt goes back in, so the lower, the darker soil from the lower is on top, and it's then from the ground surface, the grave shaft is visible. We also placed 6 areas, stripped areas, around the perimeter of the depressions that we saw, but we didn't find any grave shafts in those, so that to us indicates the cemetery boundaries. So we also checked these areas with metal detector for nails or other fence hardware. This shows 2 archaeologists that are looking at the cut here, the profile in one of these stripped back areas. And I hope you can see this. There's a little area of dark soil here, and that's part of a grave shaft. Again, it's pretty subtle. Now this is the map that we made. We mapped all these things, this all mapped to scale, and we mapped the park fence line, trees, and roads. So there are approximately 22 rows of graves in this cemetery containing at least 84 interments. 5 are marked with markers on the surface, and we exposed at least 10 more unmarked graves. So the cemetery, it's a pretty big cemetery, but it is a significant cultural resource because it's part of the founding and early settlement of Fulton County in that general area. One more project I'd like to tell you about. This project was not in the Ozarks, but was nevertheless interesting. The Delta Cultural Center in Helena, Arkansas contacted us in 1999 to prepare detailed plan and topographic maps of 3 African American cemeteries near Helena. Additionally, we recorded all the information as it appears on each grave marker in these cemeteries. The maps and list of interments were used to create a book brochure that's been made available to the public, in particular for people coming back to Phillips County for Decoration Day and Memorial Day activities. The response to this project has been overwhelmingly positive, and I continue to field requests for copies of the report that I did. I brought it with me. It's that big, thick report, because one of the cemetery has over 200 graves, so it's a lot of information. Okay, here's the Dixon Cemetery in Helena. This is just north of the Helena city limits, near the southern edge of the St. Francis National Forest. Significant clearing of overgrown vegetation had been done, but we helped do more. The Phillips County African American Cemetery Association, founded in 1997, had received funding to restore and protect these cemeteries and provide information to descendants and relatives. So at this cemetery, they had constructed a walkway through the cemetery and put a sign out on the county road. So we located 85 grave markers or marker bases representing 90 interments over an acre and a half. We also mapped the location of 91 depressions, which could be unmarked graves. Most of the markers in this cemetery were commercially made markers. As I recall, the unmarked graves had no fieldstone. You have to remember that in the Delta, Mississippi River Delta, there's very little natural stone. So any stone has to be brought in from somewhere else, say from the Ozarks, for example. The most prominent individual buried in this cemetery is the Reverend E.C. Morris, known as the Moses of the Baptists. And I'm sorry I don't have a slide of this, but his grave is the focal point of the cemetery, standing at the summit of a ridge. He was born in 1855 and was the founder and president of Arkansas Baptist College, president of the National Baptist Convention, founder and publisher of the Baptist Vanguard, and a member of the Helena School Board. He died in 1922. What we discovered in being out here and people stopping by and asking us what we were doing, after World War II, many African Americans from Arkansas and other southern states moved to northern cities, particularly Chicago and Detroit come to mind. And so these people are now retiring or even moving back to where their relatives had lived in places like Helena, and they want to know where their relatives are buried. And they want to preserve these cemeteries. The next cemetery that we mapped was established in 1873. I just included this by collecting all the information from the grave markers as to names, birth dates, and other information that's provided military service and membership in fraternal organizations / burial insurance groups. We could glean quite a lot of information about these communities. This is the big cemetery, the Spring Lake. The Spring Lake Baptist Church once stood near the cemetery. There is a brick-lined cistern remaining. The actual congregation moved and built another church nearby. This cemetery contains 240 markers, possibly representing 236 interments. So this is about 3 acres, and it's very well maintained. The third cemetery we mapped near Helena is the Saxon Cemetery. It may have been associated with one of the 2 larger plantations that once existed in Lexa, Arkansas. The cemetery contains 14 individuals and 18 monuments. It's probably one of the oldest cemeteries in Phillips County. The earliest legible birth date is 1802, while the latest death date is 1900. This cemetery is on a low rise in the middle of a huge agricultural field. It's almost 1,200 feet away from the county road. When we were there, it was all planted in wheat, and it was windy. That wheat was just blowing around us. And this cemetery is like a little island surrounded by these huge fields, and it could have easily just been bulldozed over or pushed down, and the marker's all gone. But it's there, and the Phillips County group has erected a fence around it. So in closing, these projects are among the most meaningful of my career. Descendants and relatives are hungry for information about their loved ones that comes from cemeteries. The configuration of the cemeteries and their contents in the form of memorials and spatial organization can tell us much about the societies that created them. Cemeteries are a very special kind of bounded space that reflect and express many of our basic beliefs and values. They are central to community life and to the continuity of families within communities, especially in rural areas.